Brunanburh, 26th of October 937. Who is there? Candles guttered as a door opened. The king had instructed that he be left all night in the chapel to pray. Who? He added, as a chink of metal sounded behind him. There are no guards, the voice replied. You trust yourself to God alone? From his kneeling position before the altar, King Aethelstan, grandson of the great King Alfred, on the eve of the battle that had been long overdue, drew himself to his feet. He crossed to the altar and took up one of the candle standards. The teller made a trail of stench between the altar and the nave. Who? He demanded. Osrith. She had been flung on the back of a horse and brought away from Seaster in the night. And you would prevent Aethelstan? Bishop Oswald's question dug into her mind as Osrith bounced up and down on the well-fed beast. It had been the key question. Osrith knew, the only question. But she had given her nephew the only answer, that she had been a coward, and had run to her blood family when the prospect of their elimination fell into a heavy reality. No, she had told him, truthfully. But he has the will to do it, even if he knew his limits. Another jolt, and Osrith felt a hand on her back. The rider, her abductor, had done a good job to keep her on the beast. Clearly someone who would prefer her to be alive and not dead, someone who had deprived her of her weapons. Although they were not at her hip, Osrith recognized the clinking of her own blades' scabbards just beyond her. Oswald had smiled and had embraced his aunt. You may be a Saxon-born Northumbrian, you may have grown in Alba and Irian, but your heart is Mercia, as is yours. Thanks to Ethelred, your namesake, of course. And had I not split the forces, you would not be bishop. It occurred to Osrith then that it could be her nephew who had been involved in this, that Bishop Oswald, elder son of Uhtred, had arranged for her to be out of the way of this mighty battle that would come. I love you, Aunt, Oswald had told her. I hope you get your wish. What? That you find a way with father, to be at peace before he dies. Him and Uhtred. Osrith felt the legs of the horse underneath her slow slightly. The ground had been flat, and even now, the decrease in speed did not suggest they were going uphill. So, a plot with her nephew and Uhtred? Had the dear Bishop of Seaster organized for them to confront one another? It was devious. And yet he was no less than Uhtred's son. And she felt angry, for she remembered Oswald's next words. My wish is that for you and Uhtred. Can it never be resolved? I cannot see it. At this, Oswald, the ultimate antithesis of his father, had shaken his head sadly. Osrith had taken his hands. He was so like Finan Beeg, Osrith remembered, as the horse slowed even more, little Finan, who worked their farm in Berwick and was now with Constantine. Like Oswald, young Finan was no warrior. He could handle a blade, yes, but he had little chance of walking off a battlefield. Please, God, Osrith thought at that moment, have Constantine keep her son out of this battle. But her son had a liking to try, he had confidence, he had forthrightness. But he had grown up coddled in Dunnottar, pampered with her money paying for his upkeep, and except for his early years beside Osrith in the saddle, knew nothing of the privations of a warrior. I can only know what I feel, and, in the end, you will both find the peace you crave. Osrith recalled her parting words, and the soft, silk-like hand on her shoulder. Before or after Aethelstan fights Constantine? If I guessed that, you may have me down as a witch. Osrith's heart sank. Was that it? Had the lie she had told all those years ago, which had spread faster than summer's dawnlight, caught up with her? This is your land, Osrith. Gwyddolf was of Sht, he reminded her. Rule with my father, he the east, you the west. Keep Northumbria free. Just because Alfred had a dream, and Aethelstan has another, it does not mean Constantine's dream is less valid. Osrith had thrown back her head at this, laughing at Bishop Oswald's words. Then, she had looked at his serious face. But it was only now, bumping around slung over the shoulders of a horse, did this seem significant. Yes, he was a mercenary bishop, but Oswald had an insight into the geopolitical nature of Northumbria, one which Osrith had always ascribed. The land should be independent, it should not be subject to Wessex and Mercia, neither should it be subject to Alba. When the cloak came away from her face, dawn was well in its stride. The moon was full, and it shone down, low in the sky, reflecting the opposite horizon's sunlight, illuminating the landscape from both sides, giving it a brightness unnatural for late October, of latent warm and mists and night coolness even up until midday. The morning, too, was crisp, though there was no frost. Indeed, Osrith thought it could be any morning in the dawn of high summer, where the heat of the day celebrated health and industrious gathering of harvests. Now the light seemed to mock all of that, seemed to be there to show up the enormity of the folly both Aethelstan and Constantine were about to undertake. For there was an army there, down from the slight hill onto which she had been planted, and she looked across it. They were at Eadspirig, the bear to the east of Seaster, offering a vantage point higher than the city. She had defended it once, from Ragnall, Sigtrygg's brother, and Bryder, who had mounted an attack on Bur to gain a foothold into the east, to march south of Mumseaster and to Ofoik, where the exiled Norse warrior had fought for and won the city and renamed it Jorvik, the city most revered amongst all Norse and Danes. From it, Osrith could see the Wirlam, a hammer-shaped spit of land between the Dee and the Merse, which had been gifted by Ethelfled to the refugee Norse 30 years before and had been used, from what she could tell, was now being used as a base for hundreds upon hundreds of ships, square-rigged, sheltered just north of the Bear of Bibenberg, its warriors sheltered at Dingismere. Osrith guessed a door into Mercia and beyond, he whole of Brittany. A sliding sound of boot to stone made Osrith turn around, and she gasped when she saw it was not Bishop Oswald, nor Uhtred holding out her sword belt to her but Miral. It was Miral who had taken her. Osrith took it, and pulled it to her hips, but stopped again as she made to buckle it when she saw another figure. Eswi. Constantine's spy looked at Osrith and nodded, then took a few steps away from her. Eswi, it is good to see you, Osrith, he told her, his voice grim. No warmth came from him. I will tell your son I have seen you. With that, he nodded to Miral again and strode down the outside of the burh, towards a horse, a bay mare which looked like one Osrith recognized, although all horses in Alba the same. Miral put out a hand as if anticipating her to follow him, lowering it, watching her watch the man's descent. She had spent years beside Eswi, garnering information for Constantine. She wanted to say ... She wanted to tell him. Osrith Lackland. The voice could be no other. Behind her, a man stood, half hidden in a cloak as the morning's strange light illuminated his skin. His figure seemed slighter than she remembered, and all at once, Osrith believed she saw in front of her, not Aethelstan, who her senses were telling her it could only be, but his grandfather, Alfred. He had Alfred's piety and his sense, and Osrith was transported to a place where she had never been, having been merely a child, having been crossing the northern sea to Lindisfarne, to Culdee's monastery, to Dunnottar when Ethandun had happened. Alfred was alone, there, in swamps, his family, his friends, his warriors living like the lowliest of men on mealy bread and watered-down sheep's milk while he hatched a plan, enacted the network of nobles to meet with their armies with him at one place, Ethandun, at one time, to fight for the very soul of the Saxon and Anglish kingdom's existence. Aethelstan, too, was alone, and, from what she could see, stood above all others, stood proud of Seaster, where his own nobles' warriors were, even now, assembling on the western side of the city. This, like Ethandun, was to be all or nothing. There could be no other choice. Compromise and diplomacy was at an end. Both kings wanted the same land and were garnering factions, interested or not, to choose. Lord King, Osrith murmured as she looked upon Ethelstan's face, which was turned to the west now, the sun at his back, the moon on his skin. Miral had brought her to see him, then, at his request. Presumably, what was so important that she should be before King Aethelstan the morning before a great battle? Forgive me, Aethelstan said to Osrith, his face not turning from the Wirlam. My body is stiff from kneeling. Osrith looked over her shoulder. Behind her, the fortress loomed, the gate open, guarded. The chapel beyond. Aethelstan must have been there all night, looking over the northwestern land of Mercia, Northumbria on the horizon. "Would you stand beside me, Osrith?" he asked. "You are not here to run me through?" Osrith glanced to Miral and then back to the king. His lip curled in mild amusement, and he looked to her waist. "I would not allow that to happen to you, warrior," he told her. "For I believe several months are owed to the oath you gave to the Lady Ethelfled. I inherited Mercia and, as such, all the oaths and agreements therein, via your father," Osrith told him. Wind passed by her face as the morning sun glowered in the easy, warming the air currents. Aethelstan smiled again. "My father," Aethelstan echoed. "You were attached to him?" "Attached? Loved?" Osrith thought about this. "No," she considered. "Not in that sense," and she felt herself smile at the corners of her mouth too as she remembered the good-natured child who had once stolen Ethelflaed's necklace when his big sister had taken his wooden toys and burned them in a fire. "I grew fond of him. I defended him, taught him to fight. Those were good times," even though every other heartbeat had her looking over her shoulder for the presence of Ethelwald. "He was a good person, though he did not wish to be king." She looked over Ethelstan's face. "He wished to be with your mother, and have a life of a noble." "He loved her, and she him. I will never forget his face when he told me had married in secret. She made him happy as no other woman ever did." "I do still remember him with fondness," Osrith admitted. "And, yet, your son," Aethelstan said, glancing back to the lower ground, where a dark shadow seemed to be collecting on the ground by the Merse. An army was gathering, Anlaf's army. "He is with his father," Osrith told Aethelstan. "Or, at least, he was. And then he returned to his adoptive kin. He is probably down there, with the Norse." "You know they are Norse." Aethelstan turned, and placed his hand to his sword. Osrith expected him to swing it out to her then, threaten her, at least, if not attack her. "I expect so. That is Dingismere, the marshes where the settlers make their parliament," Osrith told him, pointing to the settlement beyond Brunanburg. "I saw hundreds of ships on the Merse. They are presumably Anlaf's gone to his kin." "Your son-in-law." Osrith smiled. In all the time that Edra had been married it was strange that, until now, she had not thought of Anlaf as this, even though Edra was her daughter, her nephew and niece, through Anlaf and Edra, Sigtrygg's children, in effect, her adoptive grandchildren. Anlaf would put the boy, Ragnar, on the Jorvik throne, and Edra, daughter of Thyra and Beka, would first be its queen. "There is another ruling family. The girl who is entitled to the land that you passed on to your daughter will marry Utad and cement Northumbria, under my rule," Aethelstan told her. "If you should win," Osrith told him, "Constantine believes his cause is as righteous as your own." And Aethelstan's movement was so sudden that Osrith gave a sigh of exclamation when Edward's son grabbed her and held a knife by her throat. If he believed it, truly, she would be dead by now, Osrith told herself. He would not have taken the trouble to bring her to him. And she would give it to him, give him her sword. For that, he needed her intelligence, and for that, he needed to ask her for it. "Are you Constantine's spy?" Aethelstan asked her, blade by her throat. He would be able to see that it was Mersen steel she was wearing, Mersen cloth, Mersen leather. "I have left Alba and King Constantine," Osrith told him, "and I will never go back." Agreement was sealed without my consent, one which holds the whole of the Northern Alliance together. After a moment, she felt Aethelstan relax. It was a better relationship than Alfred had had with Utad. At least, Alfred hated taking the blade of a Northumbrian, a pagan for that, and yet he did it, for the good of his kingdom. Osrith suspected Aethelstan was about to do the same thing. "And yet, he is not with the Norse," Aethelstan told her. "Constantine is there, and, from their vantage point of Viadsperig, Osrith could see Constantine's banners, blue-grey with white cross bands. Some others were triangular, these were Norse or Danish, and she was surprised to see one of a wolf's head. That was Utad's banner, and yet, Utad would never go to Constantine. Clearly a trick, someone pretending Bibbenberg had gone to the side of the King of Alba. Not a sign of the Dragok, the red dragon on a white field, high wells. And, as the morning sun rose slowly, one was clearly visible near the back of the band, white, with a red hand clutching a cross. Osrith's heart beat in her chest as she recognized Domhnall's banner, as she forced her feet to the ground to prevent her from running to him, to make good her trust with her dear friend of old. As many Norse and Danes who are loyal to me are loyal again to the son of the man who I liberated, Aethelstan told Osrith, meaning Constantine, who had been brought to surrender in his own fortress at Dunnottar by Aethelstan's army and Aethelstan's navy. I went to Utad. I would be with him now, I would fight alongside him, Osrith told Aethelstan, holding on to the last of the dignity she had. Just about. Utad was her brother, and so she was standing in Mercia, as close to loyalty to him as she could get. An unavowed subject, the intruder told him, one who has never acquiesced to your overlordship. She paused, then added, one who would pray with you. As Aethelstan moved the light to the face of the disturber of his peace, Osrith dropped to her knees. Lord King, I owe you, through your aunt, service to Mercia, for the murder of a lord in Lord Ethelred's service, at harvest time, in the year of our Lord God 910, at a place north of Salop by the name of Worm. Osrith remained with her head bowed, her words cracking in her throat as she offered herself humbly to the service of a king. It had never happened before. Before this, Osrith had fallen into circumstances. By leaving what was the relative safety of Caerleguilid, she had made a conscious decision. I come to fulfill the service I owe to your kingdom, your homeland, King Aethelstan, she continued. I am but a poor, landless refugee seeking only to serve where I see fit. Osrith, for she had seen what Constantine and his allies were prepared to do to clear the land of the Saxons and the Angles, and she was glad, so very glad, that she had chosen what she had chosen, a state called England, under King Aethelstan, who had brought leadership and vision and justice. Could Constantine claim he was doing that? By what she had seen, he was not. In fact, there was not even one united leader around whom the Cymric could focus. Yes, that might have been fanciful, that might have, in effect, been Constantine, for it was he who could pull each and every one of his allies to him, where none of them could do the same for each other. But Constantine, Christian as he was, had not shown caution, not advised restraint on any one of his allies. As she had ridden down from Caerleguilid, she was in the company of many hundreds of refugees from towns and villages in the west of Northumbria, and not all of them were Saxons. Settled Norse and Danes too, and groups of disparate Cymric civilians living in the higher ground north of Momcisto were limping south with their mean and meager possessions being all they could carry, or all they had left after their houses being raided and sacked by anyone, with no law, only their own consciences. And they were not very moral consciences. Babies, dead on the roadside, women dead, having been despoiled, men speared and left where they died, animals that might have been useful, killed, houses burned to the ground, possessions destroyed, not taken such as those might, for survival, but for mischief, for horror. It was as if the worst of the Great Dane army that Alfred's brothers had faced in the decades when Ethelfled and Edward were born were coming back and reminding a country that had lived in relative peace for several decades that horror and death could come, and was coming, back. So, hungry, for no settlement that had been lucky enough to survive the raids was going to be stupid enough to let a stranger in, nor even sell them food, and tired. Osrith had got as far as Blackburn and eventually sold her horse to a man in exchange for some of the food his wife had been cooking. If you're foolish enough to hang around and eat it, he said to her, as they left on the horse she had stolen from Caerleguilid. But, it was the boy that had been staked to a cross and left to die, now long gone with no hope of revival, just outside Rumfcofer, that eventually got to Osrith. He looked so much like she remembered young Finan looking, and she wondered where he was. Safe with Utad, she hoped, and not mixed up in any of this raiding, nor with Constantine and his men. For, if he was, he may well be facing his father and his brother across the battlefield, Osrith thought. And herself, too, for it had been that which had made Osrith know for sure which side she was on, and it was not on the side of those who had gone Viking in Northumbria and the northern lands of Mercia. It was to Aethelstan she was going to turn. and Osrith knew that, if the tables had been turned, and the last he had seen of Osrith was dancing with the Gales at Dunnottar, that she would not believe he had come as a willing ally in what was likely to be the greatest battle in living memory. So, it was not Aethelstan to whom she must speak, but to someone else who lived at Seaster, who worked at Seaster. Would it not have been simpler for her to have stayed that time, when her nephew, Utad's eldest son, had offered for her too? Perhaps he would do so again, and maybe Osrith would take up the offer. But now, she knew she must try. She wanted to fight, not retire to a convent. So she needed to ask Bishop Oswald, formerly Utad's eldest son with Gisela, formerly Utad, to take her to see his father, who would, no doubt, be somewhere in the plain of the low-lying land south of the Merse, which she could see from the ridge on the northern side of the river, the Northumbrian side. It had to be him, for she knew Utad would not believe her, either, especially when he heard, as Aethelstan will have heard, that her claim to the lands of Caeligwylid, and acceptance of dower marriage to Domhnall. Because, why would anyone believe her, Osrith, who had fought so long and so hard to be the Lady of Berwick, who had, she now realized, condoned raids into southern Northumbria and even further south, into Lindsey, by her people? Seaster would be easy to get to. Convincing her nephew that she was a refugee would be the hard part. So long she had been an ally of Constantine. That was what Osrith had thought a week before. But she had been wrong, so very wrong. The worst had been that Utad had refused to see her. So she made as if to say goodbye to Bishop Oswald, and take herself south, claiming she had friends in Wessex. But it was a lie. Osrith was going nowhere except to petition the one person who could help her. And for that, she had to offer him something of worth. Aethelstan valued oaths being honored, what king wouldn't? And Osrith owed Mercia most of her death sentence, commuted by the Lady of the Mercians, service to the realm of 2 years. Then, King Aethelstan, Rex Totius Britanniae, concluded, "Pray with me." Later, much later, Osrith would consider that night, remember what she had been told of Alfred, in the marshes of Somerset, isolated, sending messages to lords to meet at Ethandun. And they came, and fought, and Guthrum capitulated and was baptized. How like his grandfather was Aethelstan now, with armies converging on his kingdom for a final battle, to decide who ruled Mercia, Wessex, England, in fact. But unlike Alfred, so were the enemy. They moved together, unseen at night, both knowing that they would be standing opposite one another that morning. I did that. Some of it. People have had enough. They want to take back control of their lands, had enough of imperial domination. Osrith spoke those words to Aethelstan as the king rose to his feet, and they stood, once again, overlooking Seaster and the Wyrilum. He wishes to drive out the Say, I am Say. You are more Gaelish than the Gaels, Muriel told her. He was standing with the reins of 2 horses in his hands, both readied for battle. 2 horses. Yet 3 warriors stood on the hill of Eadspirig. Go, Aethelstan said, suddenly. You cannot accompany us. I will not be the one to make you choose. He looked behind him, to the northeast, the rough approximation of the direction that Berwick lay. Go back to your farm. Go anywhere but with us. Your fleet sails down the sea between Cumbraland and Irian, Osrith deduced. It sails past Man and no more. Aethelstan bellowed, suddenly. Stay here if you wish. Go to Berwick, or Bibbenberg, anywhere, just not at this battle. Promise me. But Osrith found herself shaking her head, and in her hand, Buey appeared. No, she told the king of the Angles and the Saxons. Number. I will not run. I will not flee. I am tired of running and fleeing. She took some steps to Aethelstan. I promised to protect you, Osrith insisted, and I will protect you. Mercia is in my heart, King Aethelstan, as it is in yours, though both of us are from its neighbors, its ancient enemies. Mercia has no one to advocate for it if not us. And I say it is paid, long ago, Aethelstan said to her, kindly. You have done enough, Osrith. But Osrith merely shook her head, and then, thrusting Buey into the soil before Aethelstan's feet, waited for the king to lay a hand on her shoulder. The gesture came, though it felt as if an age had passed, and then he moved his hand to her arm and helped her stand. Osrith of Mercia, Aethelstan concluded, I would be proud to have you beside me as my warrior. Not beside you, Osrith told the king. Many will suspect, as you suspected, I may be a Gaelish spy. In fact, Osrith thought, she wasn't altogether convinced in her heart that, on the field of battle, that she wouldn't just step to the other side. Alba was lost to her. She fought for Mercia because Uhtred fought for Mercia. She would die as a Mercian warrior, or live. Miral, send the warrior Osrith to the field of battle with my horse, he told him, go with her, and then bring the beast back to me. The last glimpse Osrith had on the day that the Great War was fought, was of Aethelstan, standing in the weak dawnlight, looking down to the ground where one or other king's vision of what Britannia would be would, at dawn, be realized. 88,888,888. Sister. My man tells me the king has left the burgh. His father, face older than Bishop Oswald remembered, stood in the doorway of his rooms, almost as if stepping over the threshold would release the wrath of God upon him and he would fall unto 1,000 pieces. Lord Aldhelm, Oswald said to Aethelstan's general, who has please would you tell the Lord Uhtred what Prince Edmund told you, and what you told the warrior Egil, for want of any other member of the Northumbrian earls to inform. Aldhelm moved a weary head between father and son. Why he had to be involved in the perennial conflict between them he did not know. Yet, they were due on the field, outside Seaster. Another army had been spotted coming from the east and he was desperate to speak to the king on the matter of strategy. He had had better mornings. I believe a host has appeared to the east, Aldhelm told him. Believe, or have evidence? Your man's evidence. He accompanied Mercian lords as we rode out to Eadspirig last night. I assume you will have spoken to him. It is true, father, came his son's voice. Bishop Oswald stood a little aside, for it was not he who had addressed Uhtred, but his younger brother, who had left Bibbenberg and headed to Seaster with identical news. He stood a little ahead of Oswald, the image of his father, as well as the family name, and Uhtred nodded slightly in acknowledgement. I left Rorik and Berg in charge. The guard know what to do. We have enough food inside the fortress until the spring. Not even Elena could get out. That amused their father. But then he turned his steel-grey eyes onto Bishop Oswald. So Constantine appears, he concluded, and the potential successors to England. He looked to his elder son, as if this was a challenge directly to him, as if it were Oswald's fault entirely that the King of Alba had actually arrived. Is that what you and Osrith were discussing? Is that what my sister's offer of a blade was all about, with a postern directly into the city before even the allotted moment of battle? May I interject here? Aldhelm, weary of this, and even more so today, stepped between Bishop Oswald and Uhtred. Osrith, your sister, he nodded to Uhtred, left Alba, so I understand it, in such a way as never to return. This battle, tens of thousands of enemies stand before us. My father was at Ethandun, and, were I in a position where I needed to move on, I would have said to him that I would follow him to the end. To whatever end for my king. He glanced to Bishop Oswald. Your aunt has done just that. She has left whatever Alba meant to her, to be here, with you, Lord Uhtred. Can you not put your differences aside for one person? Osrith can no more change the course of today as could a drop of water change the tide. This confrontation has been years in the making. Decades. Centuries. Aldhelm looked between Uhtred and the Bishop of Seaster. It was Uhtred who moved first. Stepping past Aldhelm, confiding nothing except for a deep intake of breath as he passed, he stood before his son, clothed, like young Uhtred, ready for war. He was holding Feda sword, the sword belonging to Uhtred, his and Osrith's father, lost all that time to the hand of Finan's brother, fought back and won by his sister, and now in the hand of his firstborn, and then took him in his arms. 8,888,888. He will be out there, sighed Finan. Dawn had now become early morning, yet none of the birds had the courage to sing. My son. They ranged to the rest of the fortress, many companies already marching towards Brunanburg. They were to fight last, Old Helm had told them. Aethelstan had been praying at Ead Spirig, but even now, his banner of England, red with a white wyvern, flew on the high ground. The king was coming. Battle was near. With any fortune to you, he will have left the child at Dunnottar. Finan turned, and looked to Uhtred. As the men pressed behind them, he then told his dearest friend the arrangement that he had made with Constantine. Damn it, Finan, you are not a traitor, are you? Beside him, Egil pulled himself high up on his horse to watch the passage of Aethelstan and his favorites through their warriors. Men moved out of their way so he could pass to the front of the group. No, Finan reassured him. It is because of who I have promised that young Finan will be that this has absolved me of a conflict of interest. Had he not given his oath that young Finan would return to Constantine when he was grown to be a prince of Alba, in exchange an exemption for himself, as all landowners made, to the king? Had that not already happened? You are speaking in Irish riddles again, my friend, Uhtred told him, following Aethelstan with his eyes. I am Irish, Finan reminded him. He waited until Uhtred realized what he was telling him before smiling. Does my sister know this? The line was moving forward. Uhtred could see Miral ahead of him. He had told him of the arrangement with the noble girl in Cael-Iguilid the night before. Benedetta would understand. She would be too understanding. But it was not like that between them. She adored Uhtred, and wanted to be with him for himself, not to tie herself to land, or titles, or money. Uhtred could not think of a purer love, and loved Benedetta for herself all the more for it.